The rain in San Diego wasn't just rain. It was a Pacific storm, a rare, furious deluge that smelled of wet eucalyptus, asphalt, and the distant, briny breath of the ocean. It was a reminder that beneath the sunny facade, San Diego was a city forged by the Pacific and the Navy fleet that stood sentinel over it. On this particular Tuesday morning, the sky was a bruised gray, heavy and hanging low over the destroyers moored at Naval Base San Diego, signaling the storm meteorologists had been warning about for 3 days. For Leah Carter, the weather was just another obstacle in a life that seemed determined to test her. She was 24, with hair the color of sun-bleached straw she always kept in a tight ponytail, and eyes that held the tired resolve of someone who had learned the value of $1 the hard way. Standing in her small, drafty apartment, she stared at her reflection in a bathroom mirror with a crack running down its left side. She wore surgical scrubs washed so many times they were soft but faded, and her sneakers were held together by hope and a little superglue. Today was the day. Her final certification exam for the veterinary technician program was at 8 a.m. sharp. It was the door to a real salary, to health insurance, to finally chipping away at the mountain of debt that loomed over her like the gray clouds outside. She grabbed her backpack, which held her notes and the protein bar that would serve as breakfast, and stepped out into the gale. Miles away, in the gray, churning swells of the Pacific, Senior Chief Petty Officer Jake Deckard braced himself against the hull of a rigid Zodiac boat. Deck was a man carved from granite and discipline, 32 years old, with a jaw that suggested stubbornness and eyes that were always scanning the horizon. A Navy SEAL, he was leading a training exercise for new recruits, teaching them how to navigate the angry sea. Salt spray hit his face, but he didn't blink. His mind, usually a fortress of compartments, flickered for a moment to the small bungalow he rented near the base. He'd left his retired military working dog, Kaiser, with a neighbor's kid who needed the extra cash. Kaiser was a 90-pound German shepherd, a sable-coated warrior who had saved Deck's life more times than he could count in the Middle Eastern sandbox. Kaiser had no fear of gunfire or explosives. But the dog had one crippling weakness: thunderstorms. The drop in barometric pressure alone was enough to send the old dog into a panic. Deck pushed the thought away, forcing his focus onto the rookie fumbling with the navigation gear. He had to trust that the neighbor, a good kid named Ryan, would have the house locked down tight. But nature had a way of ruining the best laid plans. Back on land, the first crack of thunder sounded like a cannon shot, rattling the windows of Deck's bungalow. Inside, Kaiser began to pace frantically, his claws clicking on the floor as another bolt of lightning shook the house. The neighbor boy, startled, opened the back door to check on the yard, and in a blur of black and tan fur, Kaiser bolted. He didn't know where he was going. He just knew he had to outrun the noise. Leah Carter was walking because her 2004 sedan had finally given up the ghost 2 days ago, and she still hadn't saved enough for the tow. The wind whipped her scrubs against her legs as she navigated puddles on the sidewalk. She was moving fast, her mind reciting equine cardiac anatomy, calculating anesthetic dosages and emergency procedures. She had to pass. There was no plan B. If she failed or was late, the scholarship that paid her tuition would be voided, and she'd be dropped from the program. The dean, a woman who valued punctuality more than breathing, had made it clear, no exceptions. Leah glanced at her cheap digital watch. 7:45 a.m. She had 15 minutes. She would make it, soaked and shivering, but she would make it. She turned onto Pacific Highway, a busy 4-lane artery that fed into the naval base. The rain was coming down in sheets now, blurring the world into a watercolor of gray and brake light red. Traffic was moving fast, heavy trucks and sedans rushing to get ahead of the worst of the storm. That's when she saw him. A large, dark-furred, and bewildered dog, darting out from between 2 parked cars on the opposite side of the road. A German shepherd, moving with a panicked, disoriented gait, ears pinned flat against his head. Leah stopped, her breath catching. "No, don't," she whispered, the anatomical notes vanishing from her mind. The dog stepped into the lane. A delivery truck, blindingly white against the gray morning, was bearing down. The driver would have never seen the animal through the curtain of rain. The sound was sickening, a heavy, dull thud followed by the too late squeal of tires. The truck didn't stop. Maybe the driver thought they'd hit a pothole or simply didn't want the insurance hassle. It accelerated, disappearing into the mist. The dog was thrown toward the shoulder, where he landed in a wet, motionless heap. Leah stood frozen on the sidewalk. The world seemed to shrink to 2 points. The warmth of the exam room waiting for her a mile away, and the dark shape bleeding into the gutter across the street. She glanced at her watch. 7:52 a.m. If she ran, she could still be at the doors before they locked at 8. If she crossed the street, she would miss her exam. It was simple math. It was the logic of survival. She took one step toward the college. Her mother's voice, a ghost from a childhood of poverty, whispered in her ear, "Don't be a fool, Leah. You have to look out for yourself." But then the dog lifted his head. It was a small, weak movement, a struggle against gravity and pain, but it was there. The dog made a sound, not a bark or a growl, but a small, confused whimper that cut through the noise of traffic and rain. It was the sound of a living thing asking why it was being left alone to die. Leah Carter swore under her breath, a soft sound of resignation and heartbreak. She dropped her backpack onto the wet concrete. She didn't run toward the school. She ran into the street, waving her arms to stop a sedan that was coming up too fast. Brakes squealed, a horn blared, but she ignored it, sprinting across the lanes to the injured animal. As she got closer, she saw the damage immediately. The dog was huge, clearly well fed and cared for, not a stray. He wore a thick leather collar with tags she couldn't read. Blood was pooling, dark and thick around his abdomen, mixing with the rainwater. His breathing was shallow and fast. Shock. He was going into shock. Leah knelt in the grime, ruining her scrubs instantly. "Hey, buddy. Hey, I'm here," she whispered, her hands moving with a proficiency that belied her shaking body. She pressed her hands to the wound on his side, feeling the hot pulse of life trying to escape. The dog's eyes, brown and filled with pain, locked on hers. He didn't try to bite. He just watched her with a terrifying trust. 7:58 a.m. The exam room doors were closing. Leah didn't look at her watch. She was looking at the color of the dog's gums, which were turning a pale, ghostly white. "I need help," she yelled at the passing cars. "Please." A yellow cab, empty and looking for a fare, slowed, the driver peering through the fogged-up window. He looked like he was about to drive on, seeing the blood in the mud, but Leah locked his eyes, her face a mask of rain and tears. "He's dying. I have cash." She was lying. She had $40 to her name. "Please, just get us to a clinic." The driver, an older man with a weary face, relented. He unlocked the doors. Leah struggled, adrenaline surging, and managed to lift the front half of the 90-pound animal. The dog whimpered but tried to help her, pushing with his back legs. They tumbled into the back of the cab, smearing the vinyl upholstery. "Westside Veterinary Clinic," Leah ordered, her voice trembling. "Drive fast." As the cab sped off, merging into traffic, Leah looked out the back window. The clock on a bank sign flashed 8:01 a.m. The door to her future had just locked. She turned back to the dog, her hands buried deep in his fur, pressing hard against the wound. "You'd better be worth this," she whispered to the unconscious animal. "You'd better live." Kaiser let out a long, ragged breath, his head heavy in her lap as the cab raced through the storm. Westside Veterinary Clinic was normally a place of quiet healing, smelling faintly of antiseptic and expensive dog food. But when the taxi screeched to a halt in front of the glass doors, it was more like a besieged bunker. Leah Carter kicked the door open, her arms straining under the weight of the German Shepherd. The rain was coming down sideways now, a gray sheet trying to push them back, but she staggered inside, shouting for help. Brenda, the clinic's receptionist, a woman in her 60s with a shock of red hair and a penchant for knitting sweaters for cats, dropped the phone in shock. "Leah, what on earth?" she stammered, rushing around the counter. "Dr. Evans isn't here. The bridge on 264 is flooded out. He called 5 minutes ago, said he was trapped on the other side of the river." Leah didn't stop moving. She carried the dog straight through the waiting room, kicking open the double doors into the surgical suite. "I don't need Dr. Evans," she gasped, heaving the massive animal onto the steel table. "I need an 4-line, an 18-gauge, and the crash cart. Now, Brenda." The older woman hesitated for a second, looking at the student who technically wasn't allowed to touch a scalpel without supervision. But the ferocity in Leah's eyes galvanized her into action. The dog was fading fast. His gums were white as porcelain. Leah grabbed the clippers, shaving a patch on his foreleg with shaking hands before threading a catheter into the vein. A flash of blood. She taped it down. "Fluids, wide open," she commanded, her voice sounding strange to her own ears, distant and professional. She palpated his abdomen. It was distended, tight as a drum. "He's bleeding internally, probably a ruptured spleen from the impact." She grabbed the ultrasound probe. Free fluid everywhere. Pockets of black blood filled the screen. The phone on the wall rang. It was Dr. Evans. Brenda put it on speaker. "Leah," the vet's voice crackled through the storm static. "Brenda says you brought in a trauma. I can't get there, kid. The roads are gone. Leah looked at the dog. His heart monitor was blaring a shrill warning. He's got a hemoabdomen, Dr. Evans. Ruptured spleen. He's got maybe 10 minutes before he codes. I have to go in. Silence on the line, heavy and terrifying. Leah, Evans warned. You're a student. If you operate and he dies, or even if he lives, the liability. If I don't operate, he dies, Leah yelled, desperation finally cracking her voice. I am not letting him die on this table. A long pause, then a sigh. Do it. I'll stay on the line. God help us both. For the next hour, the storm outside ceased to exist. The world shrank to the circle of flesh illuminated by the surgical light. Leah scrubbed in, her hands becoming steady the second she picked up the scalpel. It was a splenectomy, a procedure she'd watched a dozen times but never performed. She made the incision. Blood welled up, dark and frightening. But her training took over. Clamp, ligate, cut. Her mind replayed textbook pages layered over the reality of warm tissue and the smell of metal. Brenda monitored the anesthesia, whispering prayers. There was a moment, terrifying and silent, when the dog's blood pressure bottomed out, the monitor flatlining into a single, steady tone. Epi, Leah ordered, her hands deep in the abdominal cavity, massaging the heart through the diaphragm. Come on, buddy. Don't quit. You've got people waiting for you. The rhythm hesitated, then returned, a weak blip that sounded like the most beautiful music she had ever heard. When she finally closed the incision, suturing muscle and skin with precise loops of thread, exhausted, she leaned against the wall, sliding down to the cold tile floor. The dog was alive. Miles away, in the climate-controlled silence of the college exam room, a very different kind of drama was unfolding. The room was filled with the scratch of pencils and the anxious energy of 50 students. At the front of the room stood Dean Eleanor Albright. Albright was a woman who wielded power like a weapon. She was tall, thin, with silver hair cut in a sharp bob that never moved, and she wore a tailored Chanel suit that cost more than Leah's entire year's rent. She was the gatekeeper of the vet program, a woman who believed prestige was a resource to be guarded. She walked the aisles, the clicks of her heels a menacing rhythm. She stopped at the empty desk in the third row, Leah Carter's desk. Albright glanced at her platinum watch. 8:15 a.m. She pursed her lips, a gesture of distaste that deepened the lines around her mouth. She had never liked Carter. The girl was talented, yes, but she had the shabby air of the working class about her. She worked double shifts at a diner, smelling of grease and fatigue, and lacked the polished pedigree Albright felt the school deserved. A shame, Albright murmured to the proctor, though her tone suggested satisfaction more than regret. Talent is useless without the discipline to be on time. Mark her absent, and draw up the dismissal papers. Leah didn't leave the clinic that night. She slept on a pile of blankets in the recovery kennel, her hand threaded through the bars, resting on the German shepherd's paw. Every time he stirred or whimpered, she was awake, checking his gums, checking the drain tubes, whispering soft reassurances. By morning, the storm had broken, leaving the city washed clean and bright. The dog, whose tags read Kaiser, was awake. He was weak, groggy from the drugs, but when Leah opened the kennel, he licked her hand, a rough, wet gesture of gratitude that broke her heart all over again. Dr. Evans arrived at 7 a.m., looking haggard. He checked the sutures, checked the chart, and then looked at Leah with something like awe. You saved him, Leah. That was world-class work. He paused, his face falling. But you missed your exam. Leah nodded, the reality crashing down. I have to go explain. If I hurry, maybe Dean Albright will understand. It was a medical emergency. Evans looked doubtful, but he handed her a fresh set of scrubs to replace her blood-stained ones. Good luck, kid. The university's administration building was a fortress of brick and ivy designed to make you feel small. Leah ran up the steps, hair disheveled, dark circles under her eyes, looking every bit the desperate student. She burst into the dean's office just as Eleanor Albright was pouring her morning tea from a porcelain pot. The office smelled of lavender and judgment. Dean Albright, please. I can explain, Leah began, the words tumbling out. Albright didn't look up. She continued stirring her tea, the spoon making a delicate clinking sound. You're 24 hours late, Miss Carter. I had an emergency, Leah pleaded, stepping forward, placing the intake form from the clinic on the mahogany desk. A dog was hit by a truck. There was no one else. The roads were flooded. Dr. Evans couldn't get through. I had to perform a splenectomy or he was going to die. He's a service animal. I think he's trained. Albright finally looked up. Her eyes were ice blue, devoid of warmth. She picked up the intake form with 2 fingers as if it were contaminated. A dog? She repeated flatly. You missed the most important exam of your career for a stray animal. He's not a stray. And yes, I saved a life. Isn't that what we're here to do? Leah's voice rose, trembling with indignation. Albright stood, smoothing her skirt. She picked up the paper, the proof of the surgery, the proof of Leah's skill, and slowly, deliberately, tore it in half. The sound was louder than the storm had been. We are here to produce doctors, Ms. Carter. Doctors who can be trusted. Doctors who understand that their first duty is to their professional standing and the schedule of this institution. She dropped the torn pieces into the wastebasket. Emotion is a liability in medicine. You let your heart overrule your head. That makes you dangerous. I'm a good vet, Leah whispered, tears finally welling. I'm the best student in this class. You were a student, Albright corrected, sitting and opening a file. Now you're a liability. Your scholarship required maintaining good standing. Missing a final exam results in an automatic course failure, which drops your GPA below the threshold. You are dismissed, effective immediately. And don't bother applying for a credit transfer. I will make sure every program in the state knows you abandoned your post. She gestured to the door. Leave my office and take your poverty of character with you. Leah stood there for a moment, shattered, listening to the ticking of the clock on the wall, the clock that had counted down her failure the day before. She turned and walked out, the heavy oak door clicking shut behind her, sealing her off from the only life she had ever wanted. She walked out into the bright, cruel San Diego sun, a surgeon with no license, a hero with no future. The ocean was calm now, a deceptive sheet of glass that gave no hint of the violence it had held 24 hours earlier. Senior Chief Petty Officer Jake Deckard stepped off the transport at Naval Amphibious Base Coronado, his boots hitting the concrete with a familiar, heavy thud. He was exhausted, his muscles tight from 3 days of high-intensity drills in frigid water. But his mind was already miles away, focused on the bungalow on East Ocean View Avenue. He threw his gear into the back of his beat-up Ford F-150 and drove. The silence of the cab pressed in on him. He had a bad feeling. It was a particular kind of intuition, a prickle at the back of his neck he usually only felt in combat zones before an ambush. He tried to shake it off, blaming it on leftover adrenaline. But as he turned into his driveway, the feeling solidified into a knot of ice in his gut. The gate to the backyard was wide open, unlatched, creaking softly in the breeze. Ryan, the neighbor's teenage son who had been house-sitting, was sitting on the front steps, his head in his hands. When the boy looked up, his face was streaked and tear-stained. Deck was out of the truck before he even turned off the engine. "Where is he?" Deck asked, his voice dangerously low and calm. Ryan scrambled to his feet, trembling. "The thunder, Mr. Deckard. It was so loud. I opened the door to check the fence and he panicked. He just bolted. I looked everywhere. I called the animal shelter. The police. I'm so sorry." Deck didn't yell. He didn't waste energy on anger when there was work to be done. He shifted into operational mode. He checked the local shelters online. His fingers flew across his phone screen. Nothing. Then he checked the emergency vet clinics. He called the first 2. No answer. He called Westside Veterinary Clinic. "We have a shepherd," a woman's voice said, sounding tired but kind. "Hit by a car yesterday morning. He was critical but he's stable." Deck felt the world tilt. He hung up, got back in his truck, and drove. He drove with the controlled aggression of a man who knows that speed is a weapon. When he stormed into the clinic, he looked like a thundercloud. 6'2", packed with the dense muscle of an active duty operator, wearing a gray hoodie that couldn't conceal his military bearing. His dark hair was cut high and tight, his eyes scanning the room for threats. Brenda, the receptionist, looked up and silently pointed toward the recovery kennels. Dr. Evans was standing beside a cage, checking a chart. He was a short, balding man with kind eyes and a slight stoop, the look of a man who had spent 30 years bending over sick animals. He stepped aside as Deck approached. Inside the kennel, Kaiser lay on a thick blanket. He looked smaller than Deck remembered, his powerful chest shaved and bandaged, and 4-line tape to his leg. But at Deck's scent, the dog's tail gave a weak thump against the floor. Deck dropped to his knees, the steel bars vanished. He reached through, his rough hand cupping the dog's head, his forehead resting against the wire mesh. "I'm here, buddy," Deck whispered, his voice thick. "I got you. You're safe." This wasn't just a pet. Kaiser was the reason Deck was still breathing. 2 years ago, in the dust of Kandahar, It was Kaiser who had latched onto an insurgent's arm seconds before the man could detonate his vest. It was Kaiser who had slept across the barracks doorway. They had a blood debt, a bond forged in fire and silence. To lose him to a car accident in California would be a failure Deck could not have survived. He shouldn't have made it, Dr. Evans said quietly, breaking the silence. Deck stood, wiping his face with the back of his hand, his expression hardening back into stone. Who saved him? Was it you? Evans shook his head, looking down at the chart. No, I was stuck on the other side of the Elizabeth River. The surgeon was a student, a girl named Leah Carter. Deck frowned. A student? Is she here? I need to pay her whatever she wants. Evans sighed heavily, taking off his glasses and rubbing the bridge of his nose. She's not here, and she's not coming back. She performed the surgery off the books because Kaiser was bleeding out. She missed her final exam to do it. The dean, she expelled her this morning. Deck stared at the doctor, processing the information. She was expelled for saving my dog. She traded her career for his life. Evans confirmed it, his voice bitter. She knew the rules. She did it anyway. And then Dean Albright threw her out like garbage. A cold rage began to build in Deck's chest. It was a different kind of anger than the heat of battle. This was the anger of injustice. He looked back at Kaiser, sleeping peacefully, thanks to a stranger who had just destroyed her own life to save him. In the SEAL teams, there was a code. You don't leave a man behind. You don't leave a teammate, and you don't leave the people who have your back. This girl, this Leah Carter, had his back when he wasn't there to do it himself. She was part of the team now, whether she knew it or not. Where is she? Deck asked. The university, Evans said. She was going to clear out her locker. Deck arrived on the university campus 20 minutes later. It was another world. Manicured lawns, red brick buildings, students walking in groups, laughing about parties and grades. Deck felt like an alien here. He parked illegally in a faculty spot and walked toward the science building Dr. Evans had described. He didn't know what she looked like, but he knew what defeat looked like. He stood near the entrance, leaning against a pillar, and watched. And then he saw her. She came out a side door, struggling with a cardboard box that looked too heavy for her. She was small, dressed in jeans and a faded hoodie, her hair escaping from its ponytail. She looked exhausted, her shoulders slumped, but she was walking with a strange, fragile dignity. She wasn't alone. A group of 3 students, 2 guys in expensive polo shirts, and a girl with a designer bag were trailing her. They weren't just walking, they were circling. Hey, Carter, one of the guys yelled, his voice echoing off the brick. Got that job at the pound yet? I hear they're hiring kennel cleaners. The girl with the bag laughed, a sharp, cruel sound. Imagine getting expelled for playing hero with some roadkill. My dad said Albright was laughing about it at the faculty dinner. Called you pathologically unprofessional. Leah didn't turn around. She readjusted her grip on the box, her knuckles white. Just ignore them, Deck heard her whisper to herself as she passed 10 feet from him. She didn't see him. She was looking at the ground, trying to make it to the bus stop without braking. The polo-shirted guy sped up, stepping in front of her to block her path. Aw, don't cry, Leah. Maybe you can apply to community college in a few years if they take academic rejects. He reached out and tapped the box she was holding, nearly knocking it from her grasp. A book slid off the top and landed in a puddle. Leah froze. She looked at the book, a thick veterinary atlas, soaking up dirty water. She looked up at the boy, and for a second, Deck saw the fire in her eyes, the same fire that must have been there when she held a scalpel in the storm. But then it went out, extinguished by the weight of her reality. She bent to pick up the book. Deck pushed himself off the pillar. He didn't run. He didn't shout. He moved with the terrifyingly silent grace of a predator entering a fight. He walked straight into the circle, his boots splashing in the puddle, and stood between Leah and the boy. He was a head taller than the student, his shadow engulfing him. Deck didn't say a word. He just looked at the boy. He looked at him with eyes that had seen things this kid couldn't imagine in his worst nightmares. Eyes that had seen cities burn and friends die. The air around them seemed to drop 10 degrees. The boy's smirk vanished. He stumbled back a step, his instinct screaming that he was in the presence of something dangerous. Is there a problem? Deck asked. His voice was low, a soft rumble that vibrated in the air. We were just messing around, the boy stammered, his eyes darting to Deck's scars and the way he stood, balanced and ready. Didn't look like a joke, Deck said. He didn't blink. Leave. It wasn't a suggestion. The 3 students scurried away, muttering apologies, hurrying toward the safety of the library. Deck turned. Leah was standing there, clutching her wet book, looking up at him with wide, confused eyes. She saw a man who looked like he was carved from granite, but who was looking at her with an expression of profound, aching gratitude. "You dropped this," Deck said, gently taking the book from her trembling hands and wiping the mud from the cover with his sleeve before placing it back in her box. "I'm Jake Deckard," he said, holding out his hand. "You saved my dog. You saved Kaiser." Leah blinked, the shock hitting her. "The shepherd? He was yours." "He's my teammate," Deck corrected. He looked at her box of belongings, then back at the retreating bullies. "And it looks like you took a bullet for him." Leah looked down, ashamed. "I just did what I had to do." "I know," Deck said. "And now I'm going to do what I have to do." He reached out and took the heavy box from her with effortless ease. "Where are we going?" Leah asked, bewildered. "We're going to get some coffee," Deck said, starting toward the parking lot, motioning for her to follow. "And then we're going to figure out how to fix this. Because nobody messes with my team, and as of yesterday, you're on it." The neon sign above the Anchor grill buzzed with a rhythmic electrical hum like a dying insect, flickering between a vibrant red and a dull, defeated gray. It was one of those establishments that had been anchored to the corner of East Little Creek Road since the Eisenhower administration, a place that smelled of bacon grease, floor wax, and filter coffee that had been on the burner a little too long. For Leah Carter, this was the battlefield of her second life. It had been 48 hours since she'd been expelled, and the reality of her debt was closing in like the tide. She wore a stained apricot-colored apron over her jeans, her hair tucked into a net, her hands moving on autopilot as she wiped down the laminate counter. Her feet ached in rhythm with the neon sign. She'd picked up the shift right after Deck had dropped her at her apartment yesterday. There was no time to mourn her career when rent was due, and her student loan providers were sending emails in bold red font. The diner was quiet, the lull between the lunch rush and the early dinner crowd, occupied by only a few regulars nursing bottomless cups of coffee. The bell over the door jingled, a cheerful sound that was the exact opposite of Leah's mood. She didn't look up right away, focused on scrubbing a stubborn coffee ring from the counter. "Seat yourself. Be with you in a minute," she called out, her voice professional but tired. Heavy boots walked across the checkered floor, bypassing the empty booths and coming straight to the stool right in front of where she was working. Leah froze. She knew those boots. She looked up to see Jake Deckard settling onto the swivel stool. He looked different out of the rain in his gray hoodie. He wore a clean flannel shirt tucked into jeans, his face freshly shaven, but the intensity in his eyes was undiminished. He didn't look like a customer. He looked like a sentry. "Didn't take you for a greasy spoon kind of guy," Leah said, trying to keep her voice steady, fighting the urge to cry at the sight of the one person who hadn't treated her like an outcast. "I like honest places," Deck replied simply. He set a folded newspaper on the counter. "And the coffee's usually strong enough to strip paint." A new figure emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a towel. Betty, the diner's owner, a woman built like a tank turret with a heart of gold buried under layers of sarcasm and hairspray. She was in her late 60s, with thick glasses on a chain and lipstick that defied the laws of physics. "Leah, honey, table 4 needs more creamer. And don't be flirting with the customers unless he's a big tipper," Betty barked, though her eyes twinkled behind her glasses. She sized up Deck for a second, recognizing the military haircut. "Navy?" she asked. "SEAL," Deck corrected gently. Betty nodded, a flicker of respect crossing her face. "Coffee's on the house, hon. Thanks for your service." She tapped the counter and bustled off, leaving them in a bubble of privacy amid the clatter of silverware. Deck watched Leah pour the coffee. Her hands were steady, a surgeon's hands, no wasted motion. "I did some reading," he said, tapping the newspaper. "About the program, about Dean Albright. Sounds like she runs a tight ship." "She runs a dictatorship," Leah corrected, pushing the mug toward him. "But she's the gatekeeper. Without her signature, I can't transfer my credits. I'm starting from zero, Deck. Actually, less than zero. I've got $80,000 in debt and a degree I can't finish." She laughed, a brittle sound. "But hey, I'm really good at refilling ketchup bottles." Deck took a sip of the black coffee, not flinching at the heat. "You're a good doctor," he said. "Dr. Evans told me what you did in that operating room. He said he's seen licensed vets with 10 years of experience who couldn't have clamped that artery as fast as you did." Leah looked down at her apron. "It doesn't matter. The rules are the rules." "Rules are there to keep people safe," Deck said, his voice dropping an octave, becoming serious. "But procedures are different. In the teams, we have procedures for everything: how to breach a door, how to call for extraction. But when the bullets start flying, You don't follow procedure if it means leaving a brother behind. You adapt. You do what's right, not what's written. He leaned forward, his forearms on the counter. I need you to understand who you saved. Leah, Kaiser isn't just some dog I play fetch with in the park. He took a breath, staring into the black liquid in his cup as if it held memories. 2 years ago, we were in the Peck River Valley, pitch black, nasty terrain. We were hunting a high-value target, a bomb maker. We walked right into an ambush. Leah stopped wiping the counter. The diner seemed to fade away. She listened, captivated by the raw truth in his voice. We were pinned down, taking fire from 3 sides. I took some shrapnel in the leg, couldn't move. A gunman stepped out of a cave mouth about 20 yards to my left. He had an AK-47 and he had a clean shot on me. I couldn't get my weapon up in time. Deck looked up, locking her eyes. Kaiser didn't wait for a command. He just went. He covered those 20 yards in 2 seconds. He took a round in the shoulder and still took the guy down. He held him until the rest of the team could move up. He saved my life, Leah. He saved my team. He's a decorated war hero. He's got a rank. He's got a military record. Deck's voice cracked with emotion. When you saved him, you didn't just save a dog. You saved a veteran. You saved the only family I have left. Leah felt a tear trace a path down her cheek. She wiped it away quickly. I didn't know, she whispered. I just saw him hurting. That's why it matters, Deck said. You didn't do it for a medal. You didn't do it because you knew he was special. You did it because you have honor. He reached into his back pocket and pulled out a checkbook. It was a simple, leather-bound book, not a billionaire's platinum card, but the offer was heavy. I have my savings. Combat pay I never spent because I was always deployed. I checked your tuition balance. I can write a check right now to cover the debt. You could go to another school, start fresh somewhere else without that hanging over your head. Leah looked at the checkbook, then back at Deck. For a moment, the temptation was overwhelming, to be free of the crushing financial pressure, to start over. But then she thought of Dean Albright's dismissive smirk. She thought of the accusation that she lacked character. If she took the money, she was just buying her way out, proving Albright right that she needed a handout to survive. She slowly shook her head, pushing the checkbook back toward him. No, she said, her voice firm. I can't take your money, Deck. It's not charity, Deck argued. It's payment for services rendered. You saved my life by saving his. It feels like charity, Leah said, her spine straightening. And if I take it, I'm just running away. I earned that spot in the program. I aced every exam until that one. If I'm going to be a vet, I want to know I made it because I was good enough, not because someone bailed me out. I want to look Albright in the eye and show her she was wrong. Deck looked at her for a long, quiet moment. He saw the stubborn set of her jaw, the pride that refused to be beaten down by poverty. He closed the checkbook and put it away. A slow smile spread across his face. Not a polite smile, but one of deep, genuine respect. Roger that, he said softly. You want to fight your way out. I respect that. Strategy instead of an easy extraction. He stood from the stool, towering over the counter, drawing the attention of the few other customers. He didn't care. He looked at Leah, his expression shifting to something formal, the way he would look at a commanding officer or a flag being folded. You may not want my money, Leah Carter, Deck said, his voice clear and steady, carrying the weight of command. But you're stuck with me. He placed his right hand over his heart, not theatrically, but with the precision of a man who lives by symbols. In the Navy, we have a creed. We serve with honor, courage, and commitment. You displayed all 3 of them on that street corner. He leaned closer, his blue eyes intense. You didn't leave my teammate behind. So, I swear to you right here, right now. I am not leaving you behind. We are going to get you back in that school. We are going to clear your name, and we're going to do it the right way, with honor. That is the promise of a United States Navy SEAL, and we don't break our promises. Leah stood stunned, the sounds of the diner rushing back in, the clink of plates, the hum of the fridge. But she felt more grounded than she had in days. She wasn't just a broke waitress anymore. She'd been recruited. She nodded, wiping her hands on her apron, a small, fierce smile breaking through her exhaustion. Okay, sailor, she said. What's the mission? Deck put a $10 bill on the counter for a $2 coffee. First, we gather intelligence. Then we acquire assets. Stand by, Leah. We deploy at dawn. He turned and walked out, the bell jingling behind him, leaving Leah standing in the smell of bacon and coffee, feeling the storm clouds finally begin to part. The command center for Operation Restore Honor wasn't a high-tech bunker buried under the Pentagon. Nor was it a sleek glass conference room in a downtown law firm. It was a corner booth at the Veterans of Foreign Wars Post 489, a building that smelled of floor polish, old beer, and history. The walls were lined with black and white photos of men who had stormed beaches and held lines in frozen forests, their eyes watching over the living with a silent expectation. Jake Deckard sat at the table, a ruggedized, manatee gray laptop open in front of him, flanked by two men who represented the best of his past life. To his left was Trace Turner, a former Navy intelligence specialist who looked like a chaotic swirl of flannel and beard, but who could find a needle in a digital haystack before most people could turn on their computers. To his right was Commander Bishop, retired, a former judge advocate general officer. Bishop was 70, with hair like spun silver and a posture that suggested he was still wearing a starched uniform under his tailored Navy blazer. He was a man who used the uniform code of military justice like a surgeon's scalpel, precise, lethal, and utterly devoid of a sense of humor. "Let's review the objective," Bishop said, his voice a low baritone that cut through the murmur of the bingo game happening in the main hall. He adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses. "We're looking for a pattern of arbitrary enforcement of university policy by Dean Eleanor Albright. Specifically, we need to prove her zero-tolerance rule is applied selectively." Trace cracked his knuckles. It sounded like dry twigs breaking. "On it, Commander. I've been scraping the university's public financial disclosures and cross-referencing them with alumni newsletters and Dean's List announcements. It's amazing what people put on the internet when they think no one's watching." Deck leaned forward, his hands clasped. "We're not just looking for a loophole, Commander. We're looking for the truth. Leah Carter didn't just break a rule. She was crushed by a system that looks rigged. I want to know why." Trace spun the laptop around. "Here's why, boss. Look." On the screen was a spreadsheet, a dizzying array of names, dates, and dollar amounts. "This column here," Trace pointed with a calloused finger, "is the Dean's Excellence Fund. It's a discretionary endowment used for departmental improvements. Now, look at this column. These are students who are on academic probation or facing disciplinary action." He highlighted a row. "Take Preston Vance 4, a sophomore. Plagiarized an entire essay. That's an automatic expulsion according to the student handbook, right? But look here. 3 days after his disciplinary hearing was scheduled, the Vance Family Foundation donated $50,000 to the Excellence Fund for new lab microscopes. 2 days after that, the hearing was cancelled and Preston was allowed to retake the course with no note in his permanent record." Deck's jaw tightened. "And Leah?" "Leah Carter is on a needs-based scholarship," Trace said quietly. "Her tuition is covered by the state. Her parents are gone. She has zero leverage. When she messed up, there was no checkbook to smooth things over. Albright threw the book at her because she was disposable." Commander Bishop leaned back, a cold, predatory smile touching his lips. "Quid pro quo. It's subtle, disguised as philanthropy, but the statistical correlation is undeniable. She's running a pay-to-play scheme. The rich buy forgiveness. The poor get disciplined. It's not just unethical when state funds are involved in the university budget. It's bordering on fraud." Deck stood, his chair scraping against the floor. The anger that had been simmering in him since he'd seen Leah crying in the rain was now a focused, white-hot flame. "She called Leah pathologically unprofessional," Deck said, his voice low. "She humiliated her. She destroyed a good soldier's career to keep her stats clean for the donors." He looked at Bishop. "Do we have enough to move?" Bishop closed his leather briefcase with a satisfying snap. "We have enough to start a war, son, but we need to declare it in person." The next morning, the atmosphere in the university's administration building changed the moment the heavy glass doors opened. Jake Deckard had traded his flannel and jeans for the most sacred clothes he owned, his service dress blues. The dark blue wool was immaculate, tailored to fit his broad shoulders. On his chest, the rows of ribbons told the story of his life. The Bronze Star with Valor, the Purple Heart, the Combat Action Ribbon, and the specialized insignia of the SEAL teams, the eagle-topped trident gleaming gold under the atrium lights. He didn't walk, he marched, his stride even and rhythmic. At his side, Commander Bishop matched his pace, carrying his briefcase like a weapons case. Students stopped in the hallways, lowering their phones, conversations dying. There is a particular gravity to a man in full dress uniform, a weight of history and sacrifice that demands silence. They walked past the receptionist, who was too stunned to ask for an appointment, and went straight to the double oak doors of the dean's office. Dean Eleanor Albright was in the middle of a phone call, laughing softly at something a donor was saying when the doors opened without a knock. She looked up, annoyed, her hand covering the receiver. "Excuse me, you can't just barge in here. I'm in a meeting." Deck stood at parade rest in the center of the room, filling the space with an overwhelming presence. He didn't speak immediately. He just looked at her. He looked at the expensive art on the walls, the crystal vase on her desk, and finally, at her eyes. Bishop stepped forward, placing a single manila folder on her desk. "Good morning, Dean Albright. I'm Commander Arthur Bishop, Judge Advocate General's Corps, retired. And this," he gestured to Deck, "is Senior Chief Petty Officer Jake Deckard, United States Navy SEALs. We're here representing the interests of Ms. Leah Carter." Albright slowly hung up the phone, her eyes narrowing. She scanned Deck's uniform, her lips curling slightly. She recognized the rank, but to her it meant service, not status. "This is a university, gentlemen," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "Not a recruiting station. Ms. Carter was dismissed for academic negligence. The decision is final. No amount of theatrical intimidation is going to change that." She waved a vague hand at Deck's medals. "I appreciate your service or whatever the phrase is, but your world and mine are very different here. We value intellectual rigor and policy adherence. We don't operate on sentiment." Bishop opened the folder. "We're not here about sentiment, madam. We're here to discuss the Kensington donation, and the Parker endowment, and the 7 other instances where academic rigor seemed to fluctuate based on the bank balance of a student's parents." The color drained from Albright's face, her composure cracking for a split second before she rebuilt it. "That's confidential donor information. You have no right." "We have public records and a pattern of discriminatory enforcement," Bishop cut in, his voice like a gavel strike. "We're prepared to file a formal complaint with the State Board of Regents and the Department of Education for gross misconduct and the inequitable application of the Student Code of Conduct, unless of course you'd prefer to handle this internally." Albright stood, trembling with rage. She looked at Deck, trying to find a weakness, trying to diminish him. "You think you can come into my office wearing a costume and dictate how I run my institution?" she hissed. "This is academia, Senior Chief. This is a place of higher learning, of subtlety, of complexity. This is not a barracks where you bark an order and people jump. We operate on a higher level here." She leaned across her desk, smirking. "Take your dog and your lawyer and get out. You are out of your depth." Deck didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice. He simply looked at this woman who believed her title gave her the right to crush people like Leah. He thought of the mud in Afghanistan, the blood on the street where Leah had knelt, the silence of the VFW hall. He took one step forward, but it felt like a tank advancing. "I'm a senior chief, not a sergeant, ma'am," Deck corrected, his voice calm, steady, and brutally cold. "And you're right. This isn't a barracks." He locked his eyes on hers, his gaze cutting through her pretense. "In a barracks, we judge people by what they do, not what they can pay. We judge them by who they save, not who they know." He adjusted his cap, his white gloves a stark contrast against the blue uniform. "You think this uniform is a costume? This uniform is a promise. It's a symbol that says we hold the line. Leah Carter held the line when you wouldn't." He leaned closer, his face inches from hers. "You say this is academia, not a barracks. But honor, ma'am, honor is the same everywhere. And there isn't a shred of it in this room right now." Albright recoiled as if she'd been slapped. The room fell into a suffocating silence. Deck executed a crisp about-face. "Commander, proceed with the filing. We're done here." They walked out, leaving the dean of the veterinary school standing alone in her office, surrounded by her expensive things, looking smaller and more frightened than she had ever been in her life. News in a military town like San Diego doesn't spread through Twitter or Instagram. It travels by coffee cup telegraph. It starts in the vinyl booths of diners, drifts through the dusty air of VFW halls, and settles in the chairs of barbershops where the same men have been getting their hair cut since the Nixon administration. At Harry's Clipper, a barbershop that smelled of talcum powder and barbicide, the story of Leah Carter took root. Harry, the owner, a man in his late 70s with a slight tremor in his hands but a dead aim with a straight razor, stopped mid-shave on a customer. "You hear about that girl?" he asked, his voice a gravelly rasp. "The one who saved the SEAL's dog? They expelled her, ruined her life for doing a good deed." The customer, a retired master chief with a face like sun-cured leather, sat up, wiping foam from his lip. "A working dog? You sure?" "Jake Deckard's dog," Harry confirmed. "Kaiser, the one that hunted IEDs in the sandbox. And this dean at the university, she treated the girl like a criminal." The master chief stood up, his face dark. "Well," he said, pulling a flip phone from his pocket. "We can't have that. That's not how we treat our people. By Wednesday morning, the atmosphere outside the iron gates of the university had shifted from academic tranquility to something that looked like a dress rehearsal for a parade. It wasn't a riot. It was too disciplined for that. It was a formation. They arrived in aging pickups and sedans, parking blocks away and walking in. There were hundreds of them, men in wheelchairs wearing hats that read Vietnam veteran. Women in sensible shoes holding photos of sons lost overseas. And everywhere there were dogs, golden retrievers in service vests, Labradors guiding the blind, and retired police shepherds sitting at a perfect heel. They didn't chant. They didn't throw things. They simply stood lining the sidewalk for 3 blocks, holding American flags. The wind off the harbor caught the flags, creating a rippling, snapping wave of red, white, and blue, a sound like 1,000 quiet rounds of applause. Leah stood on the opposite corner, her waitress apron under her coat, her hand over her mouth. She had expected a lawsuit. She had not expected an army. Dex stood beside her, arms crossed, watching the perimeter. "I didn't organize this," he said quietly to her. "I just told the truth to the right people. This is what happens when you poke the bear in a Navy town." A man in a wheelchair approached them. He wore a Marine Corps jacket that was a little tight in the middle, his chest heavy with ribbons. This was Colonel Frank, a local legend who had left his legs in Da Nang but kept a voice loud enough to peel paint. "Miss Carter," he barked. Leah nodded, intimidated. Colonel Frank looked her up and down, then saluted. "We hear you saved a brother," he said, gesturing to the line of dogs. "Kaiser is a brother, which makes you family. Don't you let them crush you." Inside the administration building, Dean Eleanor Albright was watching the scene from her window with a mixture of contempt and anxiety. She adjusted her pearl necklace. "It's a circus," she muttered to her assistant. "A parade of maudlin sentimentality. They think because they held a rifle 40 years ago, they understand how to run a medical faculty." She turned away from the window. "Get Channel 8 News on the line. I've agreed to that interview. We need to control the narrative before it gets out of hand. I will explain that this is about standards, not puppies." The interview took place live at noon. Channel 8 had set up a remote broadcast booth near the fountain, a safe distance from the protesters, but with the flags visible in the background. The anchor, Maria Flores, was a sharp journalist in her 40s known for asking questions that made politicians sweat. She sat opposite Dean Albright, who looked immaculate and composed. "Dean Albright," Maria began, the camera zooming in. "The community is clearly in an uproar. You have hundreds of veterans claiming you punished a student for an act of heroism. What is your response?" Albright smiled a condescending, practiced smile. "Maria, I understand that the optics of this are challenging. We all love animals, but the College of Veterinary Medicine is an elite institution. Ms. Carter didn't just save a dog. She demonstrated a fundamental lack of discipline. She abandoned a scheduled examination without notification. If a surgeon abandoned a scheduled heart transplant because they saw a car accident, they would lose their license. This is about trustworthiness. Ms. Carter is simply too erratic for this profession." Leah, watching on a phone in the crowd, felt her stomach clench. Albright sounded so reasonable, so professional. She was making Leah sound like a chaotic, irresponsible child. The crowd of veterans let out a low, angry murmur. Furthermore, Albright continued, gaining confidence. "We have no proof of the severity of the situation. For all we know, she panicked over a minor injury to avoid an exam she wasn't prepared for." "Actually, Dean Albright," Maria Flores interrupted, pressing her hand to her earpiece. "I'm going to stop you there. We've just received some footage. It appears the intersection where the accident occurred has a traffic safety camera." Albright's smile froze. I don't see how that's relevant." "Roll the tape," Maria said. The monitor between them flickered to life. The footage was grainy and gray, timestamp 7:53 a.m. It showed the rain coming down in sheets. It showed the truck hitting the dog. And then it showed Leah. On screen, Leah didn't look erratic. She looked like a soldier in a trench. The video showed her running into traffic, nearly getting hit herself. It showed her kneeling in the grime. Then came the detail that silenced a city. The camera zoomed in. Leah was wearing a thin yellow raincoat. The dog was bleeding heavily from his abdomen. In the footage, Leah tried to staunch the bleeding, but it wasn't enough. Without hesitation, she ripped the lining from her coat, then tore at the sleeve of her scrubs, using the fabric to pack the wound. She was shivering violently, soaked to the skin, but her hands never stopped working. She didn't check her phone, she didn't look toward the university building in the distance. She was hunched over the animal, shielding him from the rain with her own body until the cab arrived. The feed cut back to the live shot. There was total silence. Dean Albright was staring at the monitor, her mouth slightly open, her face ashen. She looked small. She looked petty. That, Maria Flores said, her own voice thick with emotion, doesn't look like someone avoiding a test, Dean Albright. That looks like a doctor. The reaction was instantaneous. A cheer started from the ranks of the veterans. A roar that grew and grew until it rattled the windows of the administration building. Drivers on the road laid on their horns. The sea of stars and stripes surged, not in violence, but in victory. Colonel Frank rolled his wheelchair to the edge of the police barricade, pumping a fist in the air. "That's how it's done," he yelled. In the studio, Albright stammered, trying to regain her composure. "Well, obviously, in extreme cases, the optics are compelling." "They're not just compelling, Dean," Maria Flores said, closing her notebook. "They're conclusive. I think you have some explaining to do to your Board of Regents." Deck looked at the monitor, then at Leah. She was crying, but they weren't the tears of shame anymore. She looked at the sea of flags, at the old men saluting her, at the dogs barking in solidarity. "You see," Deck said, leaning down to speak over the roar of the cheering crowd. "You thought you were alone, but you never were. You just hadn't met your battalion yet." Leah looked up at him, and for the first time since the storm, she smiled. A free, incredulous sound. She wiped her tears and stood a little taller, ready for whatever came next. The wind whipped the flags around them, and the sun, finally, truly broke through the clouds over San Diego. The directive came down from the governor's mansion in Sacramento with the force of a hammer blow. Governor Matthews was an old-school politician, a former Marine who kept 3 rescued bloodhounds in the official residence and trusted them more than most of his cabinet. When the footage of Leah Carter saving a military working dog went national, Matthews made a single phone call to the president of the university's Board of Regents. The message was brief, polite, and terrifying: "Fix this, or I will come down there and fix it myself." Thus, the disciplinary review, normally a closed-door affair held in a cramped office, was moved to Centennial Hall. It was a cavernous space with vaulted ceilings, stained glass windows depicting the virtues of wisdom and truth, and enough seating to hold the hundreds of veterans, students, and citizens who had been camped out on the lawn since dawn. Leah sat at a small oak table in the center of the room, feeling dwarfed by history. She wore a simple black suit she'd bought at a thrift store the night before, her hands clasped tightly in her lap to hide their shaking. To her left sat Commander Arthur Bishop, arranging his documents with the precision of a man setting a table for a very grim dinner. To her right sat Jake Deckard. He wasn't in uniform today. Instead, he wore a charcoal suit that fit his frame like armor, his demeanor calm and watchful. On the opposite side, Dean Eleanor Albright sat with the university's legal counsel. She looked more like a deposed queen than a dean, her posture rigid, her eyes fixed on a point above Leah's head, refusing to acknowledge the human cost of her bureaucracy. The proceedings were presided over by President Elias Thorne, no relation to the governor, but cut from the same stiff, patrician cloth. He was a man in his 70s, with eyebrows like white caterpillars and a voice that boomed in the vast hall. "We are here," he declared, banging a gavel, "to review the dismissal of Cassandra Miller and to address allegations concerning the administration of the veterinary medicine program." He looked over his glasses at Bishop. "Commander, you may proceed." Bishop stood. He didn't shout. He didn't pace. He simply projected his voice to the back of the room. "Mr. President, we are not here to dispute that Ms. Carter missed an exam. We are here to dispute the very soul of this institution." He opened a file. Dean Albright claims her zero-tolerance policy is about academic rigor, but the data suggests it's about revenue. Bishop called his first witness. It wasn't a spreadsheet. It was a person. A young man named David Halloway took the stand. David was 22, with the rough red hands of a farm boy and a nervous tic in his left eye. He adjusted the microphone, looking terrified of Dean Albright, but he looked at Leah and found his courage. "I was a junior last year," David said, his voice trembling. "My dad had a heart attack during harvest. I had to go home to run the combine or we were going to lose the farm. I missed a midterm. Dean Albright told me that agriculture was not an excuse for truancy. She put me on suspension. I lost my scholarship." A murmur of outrage rippled through the hall. Bishop nodded, then projected a document onto the large screen behind him. "And yet," Bishop said, "in that same semester, a student named Preston Vance IV was caught plagiarizing a term paper. He was not suspended. Instead, his family donated $50,000 for new microscopes. Mr. Vance is set to graduate this spring. David Halloway is working at a feed store." The room erupted. President Thorne banged his gavel, but the noise was a living thing. Dean Albright shot to her feet, her face flushed. "This is slander," she shouted over the noise. "Do not dare to frame philanthropy as bribery. I have upheld the standards of this school against a rising tide of mediocrity." She pointed a trembling finger at Leah. And that girl is its embodiment. She is sentimental. She is reckless. Do you want a doctor who weeps over a stray? Or do you want a doctor who follows procedure to save the whole herd? She was losing it. The cool facade was crumbling under the pressure of public opinion. Medicine is science, not charity. She broke the rules. If we let her back in, we are telling every student that their feelings matter more than their duty. The room fell silent, the weight of her words hanging in the air. It was a cold, brutal logic that had a certain terrifying merit. Was she right? Was Leah too soft for the hard choices of medicine? Leah looked down at her hands, doubt creeping in. Maybe she wasn't cut out for this. Maybe she was just a waitress who loved dogs too much. Then, the double doors at the back of the hall creaked open. The sound was heavy, punctuating the silence. Jake Deckard stood up. He didn't ask permission. He walked to the center of the aisle and turned to face the entrance. "Mr. President," Deck said, his voice cutting through the tension. "The Dean speaks of the definition of a doctor. I would like to call a character witness who can speak to Ms. Carter's qualifications better than any transcript." Through the doors walked a miracle, Kaiser. The German Shepherd was lean. A large patch on his side was shaved and cleanly bandaged, and he moved with a slight limp, favoring his left side. But his head was high. His ears were pricked forward. He was not on a leash. He walked freely, his claws making a rhythmic clicking on the hardwood floor. Click, click, click. A sound that echoed in the breathless silence of the room. He didn't look at the hundreds of watching people. He didn't look at the cameras. He didn't look at the dean. He paused in the center of the room, raising his nose to test the air. He smelled the fear of the students, the stale coffee of the lawyers, the expensive perfume of the dean. And then he smelled it, the scent of rain, and fear, and safety. Kaiser moved. He walked past Deck. He walked past the president. He walked straight to the small oak table where Leah was sitting. He nudged her elbow with his wet nose. Leah turned, a sob escaping her throat, and looked down. The dog who had been dying in her arms 4 days ago looked up at her with eyes that held an ancient, wordless intelligence. Slowly, deliberately, Kaiser sat. Then he rested his heavy head in Leah Carter's lap, letting out a long, contented sigh. His tail gave a soft, thumping beat against the floor. Thump, thump, thump. It was a gesture of absolute trust, of complete surrender. Leah buried her hands in his fur, openly weeping, and for a moment, the politics and the money and the rules ceased to exist. There was only the healer and the healed. Jake Deckard stepped to the microphone. He looked at Dean Albright, who was staring at the dog in horror, realizing that all her arguments about pets and property had just been dismantled by the wag of a tail. Deck turned to the president. "Dean Albright told you that medicine is about calculation," Deck said, his voice thick with emotion. "She told you that Leah Carter is weak because she cares. But look at this dog." He gestured to Kaiser, who hadn't moved from Leah's lap. "This dog is a warrior. He has saved more lives than anyone in this room. He knows the difference between a technician and a healer." Deck scanned the faces of the board, the veterans, the students. You can teach a student how to hold a scalpel. You can teach them the dosage for penicillin, but you cannot teach them this, he said, gesturing to the bond between the girl and the dog. You cannot teach the courage to stop when the world tells you to keep running. Dean Albright taught her students to calculate the cost. Leah Carter taught us the value of a life. Deck's voice dropped to a whisper that carried to the rafters. "So, I ask you, Mr. President, who do you want treating your family when the storm comes? The one who checks the rule book, or the one who stops?" The silence that followed was profound. It was not the silence of discomfort. It was the silence of a collective realization. President Thorne looked at Dean Albright, then at Leah and Kaiser. He took off his glasses and wiped his eyes with a handkerchief. He didn't need to bang the gavel to restore order because the verdict was already in, rendered not by a judge, but by a German Shepherd with his head in the lap of the only person who mattered when the rain was falling. The silence in Centennial Hall did not last. It was shattered by the strike of the gavel, sharp and final, like a rifle shot in the morning air. President Elias Thorne did not sit down. He remained standing, his gaze fixed on Dean Eleanor Albright, who had shrunk in her chair, her face ashen. The arrogance that had been her armor for decades had shattered under the weight of a dog's head in a student's lap. Thorne cleared his throat, and the sound amplified through the speakers, reaching every corner of the room. "The board has heard enough," Thorne declared, his voice steady. "We have no need for deliberation behind closed doors. The evidence is sitting right there." He gestured to Leah and Kaiser. "I move for an immediate vote on 2 resolutions. First, the immediate termination of Dean Eleanor Albright for conduct unbecoming the values of this university and for the gross mismanagement of student affairs." He paused, looking at the other board members. "All in favor?" 12 hands shot up. It was unanimous. There was no debate, no whisper of dissent. The veterans in the back rows did not cheer. They simply nodded, a silent acknowledgement that justice had arrived. Albright stood, her hands trembling as she gathered her papers. She tried to maintain her dignity, straightening her Chanel suit, but as she walked down the center aisle toward the exit, the sea of people parted not in respect, but with a cold, indifferent distance. She walked out of the hall and out of history, a relic of a system that had forgotten its heart. Thorne banged the gavel again. "The second resolution," he continued, his voice softening as he looked at the young woman in the center of the room, "the immediate reinstatement of Ms. Leah Carter with a full scholarship covering all past and future tuition, plus a living stipend to ensure she never again has to choose between her education and her survival." The room erupted before the vote could be taken. It wasn't just applause. It was a roar of vindication. Leah sat stunned, her hands still buried in Kaiser's fur, unable to process that the fight was over. She had won. In the weeks that followed, the College of Veterinary Medicine underwent a change that felt more like a spiritual awakening than a policy shift. Dr. Evans, the humble clinic vet who had stood by Leah from the start, was appointed as the interim dean. His first act was to have the zero-tolerance sign in the administration lobby taken down. In its place, he commissioned a bronze plaque to be hung at eye level. It bore a new university statute, voted on by the board and signed by the governor himself. They called it Kaiser's Law. The text was simple, etched in gold. "No student of this institution shall be penalized for acts of a good Samaritan. The preservation of life takes precedence over the preservation of a schedule. Character is the first requirement of a physician." It was a law forged in the rain on a San Diego street corner, ensuring that no future student would have to fear punishment for doing the right thing. 2 years later, the California sun was gold and warm, bathing the university stadium in a light that felt like a benediction. It was May, and the air smelled of blooming bougainvillea and the faint salt tang from the harbor. The stands were packed, a sea of families, balloons, and flowers. But one section of the stand stood out. It was a block of 50 seats near the front occupied entirely by men and women wearing a variety of caps, VFW hats, American Legion caps, and baseball hats embroidered with the names of ships. They were the Sea of Stars and Stripes, the veterans who had stood guard outside the gates 2 years earlier. They had adopted Leah Carter as their own, sending her care packages of cookies and coffee during final exams, fixing her car when it broke down. And now they were here to see their girl cross the finish line. The university band played pomp and circumstance, the brass notes floating on the breeze. The graduates marched in a river of emerald green robes. At the head of the line was Leah Carter. She looked different from the frightened girl in the rain. Her head was high, her step confident. She wore the gold cords of the valedictorian around her neck, and her cap was decorated not with glitter but with a single, small, hand-painted paw print. She took the stage, the wood creaking softly under her feet, and approached the podium. She looked out at the thousands of faces, at the parents who had sacrificed, the professors who had taught her, and the community that had saved her. "We are taught," Leah began, her voice clear and strong, echoing across the stadium, "that medicine is the science of fixing what is broken. We learn anatomy, pathology, and surgery." She paused, her eyes finding a specific spot in the front row. "But the most important lesson I ever learned didn't come from a textbook. It came from a decision. A decision to stop when the world said go, to care when the rules said to ignore." She gripped the sides of the podium. "Being a doctor isn't about being perfect. It's about being present. It's about understanding that every heartbeat matters, whether it belongs to a billionaire or a stray. We carry a sacred trust. And today, I promise you, we will carry it with honor." The applause that followed was polite at first, then thunderous. Caps flew into the air, a confetti of green against the blue sky. As the ceremony ended, the graduates filed off the stage to reunite with their families. Leah walked down the steps, clutching her diploma, the piece of paper that made her, finally, officially, Dr. Leah Carter. She pushed through the throng of hugging families, looking for the one person who had made this moment possible. She found him standing near the exit, away from the crowd. Jake Deckard stood at attention. He was wearing his service dress whites, the stark white uniform dazzlingly bright in the sun. The high collar framed his face and his medals, the Bronze Star, the Purple Heart, gleamed on his chest. He looked like the living embodiment of the values he fought for: strength, discipline, and quiet dignity. But he was not alone. Seated at his side, with the perfect stillness of a century's statue, was Kaiser. The German shepherd looked magnificent. His coat was thick and glossy, the scars on his side hidden beneath the thick fur. He wore a special collar made of leather and red, white, and blue ribbon. Leah stopped 5 feet from them. The noise of the stadium seemed to fade into the background. She looked at Deck, the Navy SEAL who had treated a waitress like a teammate. She looked at Kaiser, the dog who had bridged their worlds. Deck didn't say a word. He didn't have to. He looked at Leah, his eyes filled with a fierce, brotherly pride. Slowly, with the precision of 20 years of service, Jake Deckard brought his right hand up. He didn't wave. He executed a slow, crisp salute. It was the salute reserved for officers, for the flag, for the fallen, and for those who had earned the highest respect. Leah felt her breath catch. She stood a little straighter, her shoulders squaring in her graduation robe. She didn't salute back. She wasn't military, but she placed her hand over her heart, mimicking the vow he had made in the diner. Beside Deck, Kaiser broke his pose. He let out a single, deep, joyous bark. Woof! It rang out like a celebratory cannon shot. His tail began to beat a furious tattoo against Deck's leg. Deck dropped his salute and smiled, a genuine, warm expression that broke through the hard soldier's exterior. "Mission complete, Doctor," he said softly. Leah ran the last few steps. She didn't shake his hand. She threw her arms around Deck's neck, hugging him tight. He held her back, a strong, solid embrace. Then she dropped to her knees on the grass, not caring about her pristine robe, and wrapped her arms around Kaiser. The big dog licked the tears from her face, whining softly, welcoming her home. Above them, the American flag on the stadium's pole snapped in the breeze, flying high and proud. It was a portrait of all that mattered: a soldier, a healer, and the loyal companion who had brought them all together. The storm was long past. The sun was shining on San Diego. And in the heart of America, the good guys had, for once, truly won.